Pioneering surf parks took 10 years to go from pipe dream to paying customers. 10 years! How can digging a hole, filling it with water, agitating that water, and asking people for money be so incredibly complicated? Today's WavePool projects get done on a much shorter timeline, thanks to lessons learned from those early adopters in the space. In WavePoolMag Sessions, we hear from the brightest minds in the business. Everything's on the table topic-wise, from choosing a tech provider to maximizing food and beverage revenue, and more. So join us for WavePoolMag Sessions. Okay, hello and welcome to WavePoolMag Friday Sessions. We're here in France, where it's Friday morning, and Sydney and Queensland, respectively, where it is Friday evening. And my guests today are Paul Chivers and Ash Presser. Today we're going to explore risk assessment and management, the process used to identify potential hazards and analyze what could happen at a wave pool venue. We'll dive into how these factors ultimately shape things like design, staffing, and insurance premiums. I'm curious to learn more about this topic, so that's why we have Ash on the show and Paul. So Ash, I'm going to give your bio here and then welcome you. Ash is a certified risk and safety specialist affiliated with the Australian Institute of Health and Safety and the University of New South Wales. He has made significant contributions to health and safety research in high-risk leisure industries, including surf parks. Notably, Ash played a key role in developing safety systems at Urban Surf Melbourne. Yes, I did read that. And Ash, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
All right. And our other guest is Paul Chivers. Paul is the founding director of Risk Facilitator and has experience across various international sectors, including TV, film, aviation, education, sport and recreation, healthcare, defense, and surf parks. Paul, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Brian.
All right, let's dig in. So, for me, what is risk assessment and what is risk management? Do the two differ? And either of you can take this. So I'm just here to learn.
It's a big start, isn't it?
Yeah, well, start big.
Because we're very much international. Ash, jump in if you want, mate. But I always start with understanding what a definition is. So if I say the word risk, what do you think? I think most people who are listening will think safety or insurance or they don't necessarily understand what maybe an international definition or an ISO standard definition of what risk is. And typically, a definition such as like ISO 31000 will define risk as the effect of uncertainty on your objective. That doesn't mention anything about doom and gloom safety. It's very different. So I guess, and Ash is probably the same, we come from a very different perspective in understanding when we talk risk and we talk risk assessment and we talk risk management. These are all different words that have different meanings. So I guess it's important we always start with the right language, because I think we all get very excited and want to do a risk assessment or we want risk management, and I think we just start at the wrong point when we really probably need to reset and go, okay, what language do we want to speak? What's the language we want to start with? And if we're all on that page, I think that's a great start, because now we can start with an established context and really understand what language we're talking. But that's normally what I find in industries is the problem. I don't know about you, Ash. I find that's just challenging.
Yeah, no, I think, Paul, you've absolutely hit that nail on the head. And I mean, in terms of risk management in itself, I look at it as a broader strategy or a methodology in which where a person has, I guess, a heightened awareness of potential hazards, whether they be financial, operations, construction. There's a broad range of categories of hazards dependent on, I guess, what that individual is trying to achieve, and really that methodology of how to I guess, reduce an adverse event from occurring. So between all of that, I think that's probably, I guess, a simplistic way to kind of narrow that down as much as we can on a podcast. But yeah, again, just emphasising what Paul's mentioned is, the language, identifying the language, the environment, and ultimately the outcomes. Because hypothetically, you may not need risk management. It sounds a little bit odd for someone to say, but you may not need it. But probably 99% in most cases, you probably need a degree of good risk management systems within your organisation or business.
Okay. Can either of you drill down for me as you walk into a surf park? Well, let's go back and let's start from building a surf park. What kind of things do I need to consider before? Like, I'll go to the Wave in Bristol and I go, okay, risk. They have some lifeguards. They tell me not to run on the wet part of the pavement. Surfboards are bungeed so they don't blow over in the wind. What are we talking about in hard context when you talk about risk at a wave pool?
I think Brian, like your approach is you're looking at probably a safety element, so those safety concepts of but in that design phase, like maybe we use a language that we're saying a risk-based approach to something. So we take a risk-based approach to something. We're analyzing the risks associated with that opportunity or whatever we're trying to do. So the opportunity is to build a surf park. And you'd really focus on actually understanding, I guess, all those stakeholders and consulting. And I guess, and I'm not really too experienced, but I would imagine, and Ash, you might be able to help with this, is that most surf parks are very entrepreneurial, and the depth of engagement with stakeholders and analysis of the risks associated with their opportunity has probably not been as robust as it should be. So that means we might not be seeing all the risks associated with our awesome idea. And if we don't see all those risks, it means we throw money at the wrong controls. And if we throw money at the wrong controls later on down the track, we ask the question, well, geez, why did that fail? And it's quite simple. It's because we just didn't identify those right risks at the right time with the right people. So, yeah, for me, that's, when we're talking development, that's where we spend the time. You take the time to get the right people in the room to have the right conversations. And that's where methodology comes into play. What do we talk about? Do we talk about safety risk? Do we talk about operational, financial, all these different elements? Because there's a lot that go into the creation of a facility like this, and Ash would probably understand that a little bit more in terms of facilities. Yeah.
Okay. So
Yeah,
Paul, I want to ask you, can you give me an example of an instance where you've seen a risk and you've dealt with it, and what was that risk?
Oh my goodness me! What, in surf parks?
Yeah.
Well, let's look at surf parks in probably the biggest elephant in the room with any surf park: the risk of concussion or head injuries. That is something that is a reality of the industry, and that is and this is a quite a big discussion in terms of. Is that an acceptable risk? Is that an acceptable risk because it's inherent, or is that induced from the design of our facilities? Is that accepted by societal? Is that a societal acceptance? Do we go from, a surfing environment where it's acceptable to get a fin chop and that's all right, but now we go into a commercial environment and it's not acceptable? That's a really, can of worms when you say, well, what risk? Because each risk has so many contributing factors. But yeah, that's a great one for industry, because for me, that is something that if I was a regulator, I would be looking at and trying to understand, especially because surf parks are at the infancy of implementation when you compare them to other sports or facilities. And I know regulators look at that as the low-hanging fruit of going, oh, wow, like let's put them in a helmet and that'll solve the problem, which is not really getting to the causal factor of what the problem is, So yeah, for me
Okay.
that's a big ticket item.
Okay, and then Ash, what's your take on that? Something like a fin cut, which is inherently you have that chance when you go surfing in the ocean, but in a surf park, that's not acceptable. Um,
Yeah, yeah, it's certainly a good question, and I mean, from a regulatory perspective in Australia, but also in the States, in Europe, I guess really the tolerance to injuries that occur at a commercial for-profit business um, changes, and it's a real rapid, dynamic legislative code of practice environment, because hypothetically you could have the same incident occur in the US and Australia. You compare the two, but the regulatory impact, the consequence, the degree in which there is a penalty for that operator, you know, research indicates that that is significantly different, which is a piece of paper that I put together last year. So I guess coming back to the basis of that question, I think ultimately operators, users, consultants, we want an environment that is fun, that where people can thrive, they can be happy, they can achieve that stoke. And ultimately, where there are serious concussions or a fin shop, like you indicated before, yeah, I think is that something that as an industry we just settle and go, you know what, she'll be right, you'll be okay, and take that Australian attitude? Probably not. But it comes down to those controls. Are those controls efficient? What is the organisation's tolerance? And I guess really, what is that risk appetite? And I think as an industry, like Paul indicated, where the maturity level is still quite infant, and that's where the broader industry in itself is still probably trying to negotiate where that sits. So yeah, back to your question. Yeah, it is certainly a changing landscape.
have, and have you found, Paul, you've worked in other industries beyond surf parks, and Ash, you as well within water parks. Is there a what is the like insurance industry their view of surf parks? Paul, you had mentioned like if there's some kind of guidelines, everyone's happy, even if the guidelines is okay, just put a helmet on everyone. Have you?
Well, I think, yeah, look, I think a lot is driven through the regulators. So really, if we look at regulators will make or break this whole industry, especially because it's at the infancy. And so if we don't see risks being managed at these surf parks, whether it's under OSHA, under work health and safety legislation, whether it's HSC in the UK, if the operators aren't managing their risk correctly, the regulators will step in. And what does that mean? Well, they'll be getting performance improvement notices. They'll be getting, you know, they'll be getting like basically notices that will prevent them from operating. And financially, they won't be able to afford the insurance premiums that they're getting. And so we're at, I feel, a very pivotal point in the industry, especially over the 6 to 12 months, that the industry group have to step up and understand that safety is an industry problem and a challenge that we need to work together on. So there's no one comes first from, oh, I'm going to be safer than you. As soon as we understand that each of the parks can compete for their commercial business, but safety shouldn't be a competition. It
Hmm.
needs to be a neutral ground where we're actually all working together and going, okay, guess what? We actually all have the same risks. And therefore, if we actually communicate about what are the effective controls as an industry, we're going to move forward with really robust controls. And then that's when our insurance premiums, our insurers and underwriters are going to get confidence in, hey, these guys are actually managing the risk really well. And then in turn, our regulators are going to have confidence. So for me, the regulators are the drivers at the moment. They're steering the ship whether we like it or not. And I've seen that internationally with different regulators who really can, especially in extreme sports, will dictate where the industry's going, you know.
Okay. And Ash, what's been your experience with regulators?
Yeah. So I mean, I've been fortunate to be in a position, having a national role, being quite close to all the different regulators and understanding, I guess, their priorities and what they're chasing. But taking it a step back, what I found quite interesting at the previous Surf Park Summit was there was a roundtable discussion around risk management and safety. And from my perspective, I certainly wasn't an American in the room, but it offered a different lens, and I guess the nature of the conversation really centered around, oh, well, we need insurance to do X, Y, and Z. And I let that conversation go for a period of 20 to 25 minutes. And it was almost like there was an absence of recognition of the value of safety and what risk management achieves, and delivers to enhance operations at a venue. So I challenged the perspectives in that room and suggested, well, hey, our our landscape in Australia and again in different continents is very different to the US. You certainly get injured. Okay, straight. I'm straight on a phone call to a lawyer, and I'm going to sue. But that doesn't work in Australia. We don't really get to that aspect or that stage until probably the eighth or 12th step. So I'd almost argue in the Australian, probably, yeah, certainly in the Australian landscape, there's a heavier onus for the operator to demonstrate due diligence, and in the event, there is a party that does want to take further actions, it's being able to actually consult in a respectful manner that inherently demonstrates that you've taken all reasonable care. You're instilling confidence in that individual to the point where they have an opportunity to acknowledge what you've said, but then also think, you know what, that is kind of applicable. My injury at a water park or a surf park or at a cable ski park is consistent to potentially what I may have done if I went on for a weekend away, for example. And I guess understanding what is applicable, what's the benchmark, really guides an operator, but also a entrepreneur within this space.
Okay, and you mentioned the juxtaposition of Australia and the U.S. and insurance and well lawsuits basically. Is there something where if one country, I know during our safety standards discussion, the panelists mentioned if America adopts a standard, then that will spread globally. Is that the case with risk assessment and regulation?
I think that certainly scares me, and it scares me because, look, standards from an objective perspective are great, but the further analysis is needed to who is driving it. Is there potentially a conflict of interest? But also to, the breadth and the complexity of the surf park industry. It is currently a cookie cutter approach. There's different technologies, there's different characteristics of the design, the build, and the usage of a surf park that I think you could have the greatest minds in the room and certainly experts, but it could have a high likelihood of creating an adverse risk or hazard to another operator in this space as technology grows, that in itself becomes a risk for the next operator. So yes, I am aware that, in California there are standards, and, great on to the guys and gals who are making progress in this space. But certainly I look at it from a degree of caution, but also what does the research suggest? What's the data that I guess fuels the decision making to be able to justify such response? And I think Paul will be able to add some really good insights into this topic. Maybe the degree in which there are standards or codes of practices are high level and they're not micro level. So, for example, if you have surfers in a body of water, there needs to be a suitable, qualified, competent persons who can maintain visual awareness for those surfers or users entering that aquatic environment. And it might stop there. So, yeah, I'll hand over to Paul to kind of get his thoughts on it.
Yeah, Paul.
Look, I think I think standards. Again, I always go back to what people think standards are. They're not regulations, so they provide guidelines. And the reason they're a standard or a guideline is because there's been robust consultation with a wider group to form the thinking or what they're presenting. So I love the intent of what standards and guidelines bring. And they're only as strong as that consultation group, the stakeholder group who's formed them. So, to have one country probably develop something, I probably wouldn't be, I think it'd be great, but you need to seek, I would like to see every single surf park in the world be part of that committee, because there's not that many that can actually form that. And right now, we have some amazing regulations and standards that help us in the water aquatic environment. And yes, definitely, they don't all pertain to surf parks. But, 80%, or let's say 70% of it is really relevant. And we can use what we've learned in water environments to make variations. And I think, if you take that risk-based approach again, it's all right to take a standard and say, hey, we're using 70% of this. However, for our park, we're going to make variations to 30% of this. And here's how we're managing that risk. If I was a regulator, I would be very comfortable with that. So a lot of people go, oh, no, we have to abide 100% to a guideline or standard. And I go, well, if it's not fit for purpose, why would you do that? So I think it's just, again, education and knowing how it can be implemented,
Okay. And in going through that, both of you, do you find yourselves in the position of, if someone comes up, they've got a great idea for a surf park, they got their technology, and they come in conversation with you and you play the role of wet blanket, you have to say, wait, you need to do this, that, and the other thing. Or is generally everyone pretty much on board to make it happen according to what needs to be done?
Well, look, from my experience, from people that have, I've spoken to who in the early phases, haven't probably seen the value of implementing a risk-based approach in that design phase. Mm-hmm. So it's normally later on when we're just thinking about, okay, we've built it, we know what we're going to do, we're in the development phase, let's manage the risk. And you go, well, guys, you've actually built the risk already. It's inherent in your design. So you know what I mean? Versus you could have actually gone, if we did this, this, and this, we could have saved millions, or we could have mitigated the risk of a lawsuit, or we could have saved heaps on insurance. So for me, it's even before just the concept, the strategy, that's when you engage risk experts and people that can actually help with methodology and grounding your thinking and your path. So yeah, for me, it's early on. It's not at the end phase.
Okay. Ash, are you pretty much see it the same way?
Yeah, 100%. Like I said, Paul's hit it on the head directly. I think there's a bit of a shock, oh, okay, well, we're at this point where we're soon becoming to open. Certainly in the past 2 years of my exposure, and you just kind of shake your head slightly and go, well, okay, we've essentially got to work with what we have in front of us. But I think the value of getting an expert in early is for them to provide the opportunity of working backwards. And what I mean by working backwards is you think of the worst case scenario. Let's say it could be a fatality, it could be excessive lost time when it comes to an employee. But I find with my methodology, starting from the worst case scenario and working backwards, it enables you to have an understanding of the common elements of law, and more so specific around occupational workplace health and safety, laws that govern equipment, emergency management. And by working backwards, you can understand what your key or likely exposures are going to be. And there's been some workshops where I've been involved in communicating that, and then going, okay, these are some significant risk exposures we may not have thought of, and then through that consultative process, we're able to draft up an additional 5 or 10. Certainly, there's aspects where we need to kind of draw it back in, because you don't want to arrive at a point of time where you're asking yourself the question, how long is a piece of string? But working backwards, understanding common elements of law, your potential exposures, I find a really good place to start, because certainly across like Queensland, Australia, New South Wales, Victoria, whilst there are to a degree harmonised laws, they all have their points of difference. Victoria certainly likes to be different, so their regulation legislation is quite different again. So I think that's probably the place to start in initial consultations with potential surf park operators.
Okay. Well, let's talk about that significant risk exposure. I would love to hear some points, things you see at a facility that kind of galvanize what this kind of high view. What are some things that I'll see when I walk into a surf park that, as a customer, you wouldn't ordinarily think of, but you guys behind the scenes, that you pointed out, and I don't know what that looks like, whether that's non-slip concrete, whether that's a certain number of lifeguards. What can you point out a few things for me and the audience?
I'll let you go, Ash.
Sure. So the few surf park projects that I've been involved in and other cross or applicable industries, the first thing I tend to identify is what that customer experience is, because grounded and rooted in your customer experience is the culture within the workplace. And the research suggests that where organisations have a strong safety culture, the better they are to be able to identify risk, take the initiative, take proactive steps, have active conversations that are respectful, challenge one another, without fear of being punished or losing shifts if you're a lifeguard raising potential hazards. I'll go one step further with that. Is in Australia, and Australia's quite progressive, let's say, in this front, is the introduction of new psychosocial laws. So when I talk about psychosocial laws in respect to safety and risk management, it comes down to a finite of, I guess, elements of are staff working excessively in terms of hours? Are their role jobs clearly defined? Do they have an understanding of what their day-to-day duties are? And I guess the degree of depth in that's one thing that I notice when I walk into any high-risk industry, is that vibe. How do people communicate with each other? You certainly have your common ones, like how are your lifeguards positioned? Are there safety mechanisms in place? Do they have appropriate signage? Does it meet, in my context in Australia, the Australian standards? But really just taking a step back, having a look of how the design or the execution of systems of work are certainly performed, is one that certainly gets my attention, and visibility of lifeguards, activeness, communication, education is not just a one-stop shop, but it is certainly embedded throughout the entire customer journey.
Okay. And then Paul, your background in television and events, do you see a difference between those industries and surf parks when it comes to risk management?
I think there is, in terms of facility management, I think it's, we're speaking the same language. I think in terms of understanding, I think what the industry grapples with is the transition from a recreational activity, which is based in the ocean and we do in our free time and we don't pay, and the transition from that recreational activity into a commercial entity and paying someone to look after us into a park. That transition is massive. And so I think that's for me the biggest difference that I see, and everyone's trying to compare, well, what are we as a surf park? What can we compare ourselves? Are we a aquatic facility? Are we like a pool? Isn't it just like if we go mountain biking or if I do snowboarding or something like, and I pay for a ski? Okay, great. So we kind of are looking at different environments so that we can get a comparison to work out, well, what level of risk is acceptable? Do you know what I mean? At the moment, that's what I think everyone's searching for is, trying to find out where we sit in the food chain.
Okay. So let me put that to you, both of you. What level of risk is acceptable right now? If you can go ahead and put you on the spot. When compared to other water parks, other industries, Paul, Ash?
Well, I think that for me is defined by regulation. Do you know what I mean? At the moment,
Okay.
we're governed by what we can do by regulation. So if, I work with extreme clients who take risk for a living, and ultimately we can do as much as we can, but we're governed by regulation. So
Mm-hmm.
I always default that. It's easy for me. It's an easy, clear line in the sand. And most regulation around the world, with I get to work with a lot of different regulations, and Australia and New Zealand is very robust compared to anywhere else in the world. And everyone could argue that I'm biased, but it's quite easy to see that it's really quite robust, and I just feel like, well, that's our line in the sand, with everything
Okay.
we do.
All right. So,
I think, sorry, Brian, adding to
yeah,
Paul's comment,
love to
you
hear what
know,
you want to say, Ash.
yeah,
Yeah.
so, I mean, whilst we, all agree and acknowledge that there is regulation in play, and I guess we're fortunate in that Australia, New Zealand, space where it is robust and it is more clearer. The key is certainly in the holder of the operator, in the aspect of, ultimately directors, staff, middle management they all have the ability to communicate with one another and through consultation determine, okay, what is our risk tolerance? What's our appetite? And just having some of those basic conversations, I think, is a healthy way to establish a good risk or safety culture, to the point where someone sees something that's not quite right. Will they have the confidence that they can speak up and certainly say something? And ultimately, my philosophy, and it's probably similar, but Paul can correct himself or me. I look at it from the perspective of, if something comes across my desk, and it doesn't have to be or involve surf parks, but if I see something and I certainly look at it initially and go, oh, that's certainly really hairy.
Mm-hmm.
My natural reaction is not to say no. It's, how can we do this in a manner that is safe, that can demonstrate good risk management principles, but also justify that risk in a manner where, if we did have to present it to solicitors, to lawyers, or to a regulator, that we have the confidence, and they have the confidence as well to go, no, you know what, your methodology is correct. You've established and identified the hazards. Yes, we've agreed what our tolerance is, and going through that framework, provides a basis in which we determine, yes, we go on green light, or no, we don't, or maybe we need to just stop, pause, and think, and potentially reassess.
Okay. And what I'd like to turn it over to you. We've covered a few subjects, a few leading questions. What are we leaving out? What have we missed in this conversation that you'd like to bring up? That can be contained within 14 hours.
Great. We'll start. I would love to. I'll throw one in the ring, is just talking about skill level and how surf parks actually assess that. So, a lot of the contributing injuries that I see are a result of skill level not being understood or overcompensated. So, I'm an intermediate surfer. Well, not really. You're a beginner, and you straight away, surf in intermediate, or you go to advanced session, and you're putting yourself at risk and others at risk. And if from what I've seen, a lot of the contributing injuries are a result of user error in terms of skill level. And so, getting back to what you were saying before, Brian, is when I'm coming into a surf park, what's the things that I see? I'm looking at how I'm being questioned, how am I being analyzed for skill level? Like when I get in there, how do you know that I'm good enough to actually do what I'm doing? And I just, it's something that I think it's really hard to quantify, but we can't just rely on skill being the only measure of, if you are skilled enough, you won't get hurt. So, for me, that's, there's my 5 cents.
And Ash.
Yeah, so this is probably one, as a I guess as an outcome of my research through Federation Uni last year, was looking at different risk and safety strategies and methodologies, and it was quite interesting in high risk leisure. So expanding from surf parks, the industries that seem to have a good degree of success had a harmonious or an interconnected approach to risk and safety. And the ones that certainly were exposed from a position of case law is that the industries that didn't do it so well often were fragmented in the components of risk and safety. So what I mean by that is, their training was siloed, their risk management approach was siloed, the legal aspect was siloed, but the broader strategy itself from a governance perspective was siloed. And yes, there's both opportunities, but there are also threats to that kind of rationale. So I think something that I think is quite interesting looking at the broader surf park industry is you do have operators that are choosing to adopt a harmonious approach into their model. Others are very fragmented. So, for example, they may engage person X to do Y, person A to do B, and in terms of risk management and identifying your controls, is it effective? Are you reviewing it? That is fragmented. So that was something that probably really stood out to me last year, and it's something, whether I go and do audits at facilities or challenge existing frameworks, that's something that really sticks out to me, and I find there's a lot of opportunity and success there for operators to just step back, think about some of these questions, and go, you know what, is this the right strategy for us? It may not be.
Okay. And is in real world applications, you're going to, your park's coming online, you want to fill the pool, pay back your investors. Is something like that doable? Paul or Ash, do you see do you see the industry being able to do that?
Right. I think any entrepreneurial startup is going to be a dynamic, taking risks, cutting corners. It's just the nature of the beast. Um, I think if you could instill a risk-based approach to how you do that, we could, at the end of the day, go back to the definition. Risk is the effect of uncertainty on your objective. What's your objective? I've got to open a surf park. Okay, great. So what are all the pieces of uncertainty associated with that opportunity? So for me, you know, helping clients actually just get to their reality, because that's what they're going to run hard for, and they'll do anything to get there. And I guess, our job, Ash's job, is to try and guide them, facilitate them on that process, and try and, hold their hand and actually get them to understand how to manage risk along that way. Because, it's going to be dynamic. We shouldn't be saying that, hey, if you use this methodology and follow this guidelines, you'll be sweet. You will not get it doesn't work like that. The best organizations get lawsuits. The best organizations get improvement notices. It just doesn't work like that. Injuries and accidents are not predictive. A lot of people would love to think that, oh, I know when the next accident's going to happen. They don't. It's all smoke and mirrors. So, for me, it's like preparation. It's all that proactive approach. So yeah, I think that's my perspective.
Okay, so that leads into my next question, Paul. Is what advice would you give to someone opening a surf park? As we close out this conversation, I always like to end these with advice from the panelists. Share some of your wisdom. Paul, what would you advise?
Look, I think I would start with understanding that language. Let's all get on the same page with what we're talking about. I would focus on consultation, like who are the people in the room that are going to help me on this journey? For me, that's the make or break. Do I actually have, and believe it or not, I would have regulators, I would have industry bodies, I would have, business associates. I would actually have this wide stakeholder group that I necessarily don't want to get involved. Like, who wants to get a regulator involved in the process? But I would actually engage them. I would have conversations. I'd get industry bodies that I'm probably not really interested in engaging. I would engage them. So I think that's the biggest point I would make, is start out well with great engagement. Deal with the bad news, because it's better to have the bad news than the surprise down the track. So for me, that's what it would be.
Okay, and Ash, turn it over to you.
Yeah, I think certainly back to your last question around, can operators, entrepreneurs, afford, let's say, risk management? I think from a financial perspective, I don't think you can afford not to. A statistic from high risk leisure industries, as part of my research, was there was one theme park in Australia, resulted in a number of fatalities. The total end cost ended up being 260 mil. So if you're opening a 50 mil surf park, or 100 or 200, just think, if shit does hit the fan, can I afford not to? Because that is a lot of financial outlay to essentially be burdened with at the end of the day. And again, I certainly agree with Paul's comments around engagement, but also being able to demonstrate your own due diligence. And I think if this is any helpful advice in this conversation, is understanding that it is certainly dynamic when it comes to your maturity of risk and safety. And probably as a closure from this conversation, it could be advantageous for operators to look at what's called the Hudson safety model. And that model, I guess, quite clearly outlines organizational but individual behaviors around the 5 different stages of maturity around risk and safety. And that I guess provides some insights of what's reactive, what are our behaviors as an organization, what's calculative. So can we preempt, can we plan, in order to achieve the next level, which is being proactive and then ultimately generative, which is a really healthy place for an organization to be. So yeah, that one's called the Hudson Safety Model. It's a really good framework. It can be adopted anywhere around the world, and certainly offers a lot of valuable insights.
Okay, right on. Thank you both. Really appreciate the insights. We were able to go from Ash's kind of like larger philosophical view down to Paul's like practical aspects. So thank you. Due to both of you coming on the show, we were able to cover a wide range. I'd like to turn it over if anyone has any questions. Hit the chat icon. We have this is from Max. You mentioned ski resorts or mountain bike parks as a comparison. Those do not have lifeguards on duty observing the guests all the time. Why do surf parks need them and take such safety measures?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting one. It's probably, Ash, you might be able to answer that because you're in that environment all the time. But for me, it's apples and oranges still. Like it needs to be proportionate to the risk exposed. So at the moment, from what I'm seeing, there seems to be probably more injury data coming out of surf parks, whether it's minor injuries, than you would experience when you're going down or snowboarding. Now, that's only relevant to what's being recorded or reported. So, like it's an interesting one. I think it would be great to say, well, hey, let's compare ourselves to those environments. But I think that's what we're grappling with. We're trying to go there, and it's probably not perfect example, but I think what you need to just get back to assessing the actual risk of your surf park and using guidelines which have already been established, and then looking at, okay, well, if we're going to have a variance on a guideline or standard that's already been precedents been set, then we're going to look at, just demonstrate to me how you're managing that risk. If the guides say you need 10 or 5 lifeguards, but you want 3, I tell you what, you better be able to demonstrate how you're managing that risk, because that's the first thing the regulator is going to ask you. So you can do that because it's a standard. But if you're going to go against that standard, the regulator is going to ask you the question, can you explain to me why you have changed those numbers? And if you can show a risk-based approach and you're confident that you've made great decisions and informed decisions and you have great controls, good luck. That's awesome. And I would work with a client to try and Ash would be the same. You'd work with a client to try and get that over the line and hopefully support them. But that's all you need to remember,
I think what Paul mentioned around industry precedents is a valid point. Depending on the location of where the regulatory impact exists, but also the risk impact in itself is different to, let's say, a ski resort. The example I provide is you have a snowboarder, all right? They, for whatever reason, lose their balance or they hit a tree and sustain a spinal cord injury, all right? It's probably unlikely that an avalanche is going to occur. It's unlikely that there's going to be a secondary degree in which there's going to need an additional level of intervention. In a surf park, if you sustain a spinal injury, well, okay, yes, injuries are still relevant, but you do have the added complexity of they are in an aquatic environment. What does that mean? Well, there's a heightened impact and degree of risk where they could potentially be unconscious. They're submerged, their airways are submerged in the water. So then we look at the heightened risks of secondary drowning from a medical related incident potentially, such as a seizure in a body of water. So coming down to that granular level of detail, to me, suggests that there is a point of difference. And whilst there are in any industries takeaways that are both positive and negative, it's probably understanding what is this surf park environment, what's our unique surf park, what is it applicable to, what are the benchmarks are, and where do we want to sit on that linear graph, I think is really an open-ended question for everyone who's listening to kind of determine themselves, but also broadly as an organization.
That's great. That's a great illustration for a point of difference between the two. So thank you for your question, Max. All right, we're gonna wrap up, and I'd like to thank you, Paul. I'd like to thank you, Ash, for taking time out of your Friday evening to chat with us here. It's been great having you on the program. I learned so much, and hopefully our audience has learned quite a bit too.
Thanks, welcome Paul. Anytime.
All right, thanks, guys.